Why was a secret guarded more fiercely than any fortress entrusted to a single bolt of cloth? For 3,000 years, the method of creating silk was a state secret of the Chinese Empire, a mystery punishable by the slowest, most agonizing death imaginable. Yet how did a single agent sent on a desperate diplomatic mission tear open the veil of this secret and in doing so unleash a century of war between two of the ancient world's greatest powers? The story we think we know, the one of peaceful caravans laden with spices and treasures, is a comforting lie. The truth is etched in blood and bone, buried in the unmarked graves that line a phantom trail stretching from the heart of China to the gates of Rome. This is the story of the Great Silk Road, not as a river of commerce, but as an artery of espionage, a theater for silent wars where the whisper of a spy could topple a throne faster than any army. It was a place where empires built walls to protect themselves from enemies, but the real war was fought on the trails, where every merchant could be a spy and every commodity a weapon. This grand enterprise, this nerve system of the ancient world, was not born from a desire for profit. It was conceived in desperation during a time of imminent collapse. In the 2nd century before Christ, the Han dynasty teetered on the brink of annihilation. To the north, the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes, were a storm of horsemen that descended from the steppes with terrifying regularity. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were a force of nature, plundering cities, enslaving populations, and vanishing back into the endless grasslands before the imperial armies could even mobilize. The Great Wall, that monumental testament to fear, was little more than a line drawn in the sand against this relentless tide. Emperor Wu of Han, a ruler of immense ambition and even greater desperation, understood a bitter truth. He could not defeat the Xiongnu alone. His spies brought him whispers of another powerful people, the Yuezhi, who had been driven from their lands by the Xiongnu decades earlier and now nursed a burning hatred for their shared enemy. They lived somewhere in the far, unknown west. An alliance with them was the emperor's only hope. But who could undertake such a suicidal journey through thousands of miles of hostile territory controlled by the very enemy they sought to outmaneuver? The court was silent. To volunteer was to accept a death sentence. Then a man named Zhang Qian stepped forward. He was not a merchant, he was a palace official, a diplomat, and now he was to become the most important spy in Chinese history. His mission, sanctioned in the year 138 before Christ, was not to open trade. It was to find the Yuezhi and forge a military alliance that would crush the Xiongnu from two sides. He was given an escort of 100 men, a guide who was himself a captured Xiongnu, and the emperor's blessing. He departed from the capital, Chang'an, and rode west into a world of myth and terror from which no Han subject had ever returned. He did not get far. Within days of leaving the relative safety of the Han frontier, his entire retinue was ambushed and captured by the Xiongnu. For 10 years, Zhang Qian remained a prisoner. He was treated with a strange mixture of respect and contempt. The Xiongnu leader gave him a wife, and he had a son. They hoped he would forget his homeland, that the comforts of a new life would erode his loyalty. They fundamentally misunderstood the man. He learned their language, studied their customs, memorized their military strengths and weaknesses, and all the while he watched for an opportunity to escape. The chance came during a period of internal chaos. He fled with his wife, his son, and his loyal guide. He did not retreat east toward home. He continued west, deeper into the unknown, driven by the ghost of his unfulfilled mission. He crossed brutal deserts and forbidding mountain ranges, his party dwindling, his body failing, but his will unbroken. He eventually found the Yuezhi in the fertile lands beyond the Pamir Mountains, in what is now modern-day Afghanistan. But his decade in captivity had cost him dearly. The Yuezhi had grown comfortable in their new home. Their thirst for revenge had cooled. They had no interest in an alliance that would drag them back into a bloody war with the Xiongnu. Zhang Qian's primary mission was a failure. But what he had discovered during his journey was infinitely more valuable than any military pact. He had seen things no Chinese man had ever seen. He saw the magnificent heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley, stronger and faster than anything in China, the key to creating a superior cavalry. He heard tales of great empires further west, of Parthia and a place called Lygian, or Rome, a civilization of unimaginable wealth with a voracious appetite for luxury. He had mapped the routes, he had identified the hostile and friendly tribes, he had unwittingly laid the foundation for a global network. After another year of failed diplomacy, he began the long, perilous journey home. And once again, he was captured by the Xiongnu. Another year of captivity passed before he could escape during the chaos following the death of the Xiongnu leader. In the year 125 before Christ, 13 years after he had departed, Zhang Qian finally returned to Chang'an. Of the 100 men who had left with him, only he and his guide remained. He returned a failure in his stated objective, but a hero for what he had endured and what he had learned. His detailed reports, filled with precise intelligence on the politics, geography, and military capabilities of the western regions, electrified the imperial court. Emperor Wu saw not a failed alliance, but a new path to power. The West was not just a source of potential allies, it was a source of strategic assets and immense wealth. He immediately dispatched new missions, not just diplomatic, but military. The first caravans that pushed west were not filled with merchants, they were armed columns, sent to secure the route Zhang Qian had scouted, to seize control of the oases, and to acquire the heavenly horses by force if necessary. The road was opened with steel, not silk, and with it came the first whispers of China's most guarded secret. The envoys and soldiers brought gifts for the tribal leaders they sought to pacify or bribe, and the most coveted gift of all was silk. This shimmering fabric, light as air yet strong as steel, cool in summer and warm in winter, was a marvel the world had never seen. And the Chinese understood its power. The methods of its production, the cultivation of mulberry trees, the careful tending of the silkworm, Bombyx mori, the unraveling of the cocoon, and the weaving of the thread were a matter of national security. Anyone caught trying to smuggle silkworm eggs, mulberry seeds, or the knowledge of their cultivation out of the empire faced execution by death by 1,000 cuts. For centuries, this secret held. It gave China an unparalleled monopoly, a source of wealth and influence that funded its armies and fueled its expansion. But a secret so valuable is a magnet for spies. And so, alongside the trade in goods, a new, darker trade began, a trade in information where the price of a single secret could be an entire kingdom. The Silk Road had been born, and it was already thirsty for blood. The first assassinations were not of kings or generals, but of humble weavers and farmers who knew too much and were tempted by foreign gold. Empires are not built on trust, they are built on secrets, and the most valuable secrets are always written in blood. The Chinese controlled the source, the jealously guarded secret of silk. But they were not merchants at heart, they were bureaucrats and soldiers. They understood conquest and tribute, but not the subtle art of the deal, the complex logistics of moving goods across a continent plagued by bandits, warlords, and capricious nature itself. The first Chinese caravans that ventured west were lumbering, heavily armed affairs. They established the route, but they could not truly command it. They were strangers in a strange land, deaf to the local languages and blind to the intricate webs of tribal politics. They carved a path, but they could not own it. They soon realized that to move their precious cargo, they needed intermediaries, people who could navigate this treacherous world. And into this vacuum stepped a people who would become the true, unseen masters of the Silk Road. A people without an empire of their own, but whose network of influence would soon span all of Asia. A people who perfected the art of being everywhere and belonging nowhere, the ideal couriers and the perfect spies. What would you choose, the raw power to conquer the road, or the subtle influence to control it from the shadows? Tell us in the comments. Your answer might reveal more than you think. They were the Sogdians, and their story is the great untold chapter of the Silk Road. While empires clashed and armies marched, this nation of merchants based in the fertile river valleys of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan quietly built a commercial empire that dwarfed all others. They established a chain of colonies and trading posts that stretched from their homeland in Sogdiana all the way to the Chinese capital. They were the planet's first transnational corporation, and their business was not just silk, it was information. The Sogdians understood a fundamental truth of the road. Knowledge was more valuable than any commodity. They were master linguists, often speaking half a dozen languages. They assimilated seamlessly, adopting local customs, religions, and even names. A Sogdian in Turpan might be a devout Buddhist, while his cousin in Persia could be a follower of Zoroaster. This cultural fluidity made them invisible, allowing them to move across borders and through hostile territories with an ease that baffled imperial authorities. They swore allegiance to no king but prophet, and their network was bound not by laws, but by family ties and unbreakable contracts. They were the perfect neutral couriers trusted by all and loyal to none. Their genius lay in their communication system. A remarkable discovery in the early 20th century, a forgotten watchtower near Dunhuang, a key oasis town on the edge of the Gobi Desert, unearthed a bundle of documents that came to be known as the Ancient Letters. Written in the Sogdian language, they were not official histories or religious texts. They were the private and commercial correspondence of Sogdian merchants from the early 4th century. They reveal a world of incredible detail, market prices in distant cities, political instability in a particular kingdom, the best routes to avoid bandits, the names of corrupt officials who could be bribed. It was a snapshot of a living intelligence network, a system for transmitting sensitive commercial and political information across thousands of miles with remarkable speed and efficiency. These letters were often carried by fellow merchants traveling in the opposite direction, a private postal service that was faster and more secure than any imperial system. They used coded language and subtle allusions that would be meaningless to an outsider but perfectly clear to the recipient. This was not just business correspondence, it was the lifeblood of a shadow empire. Empires rise and fall, but a well-placed piece of information can outlive them all. The Sogdians used this information to play the great powers against each other with breathtaking skill. They served as diplomats and advisors to the nomadic Turkic Khans who controlled the steppes, often instigating conflicts or brokering peace treaties, depending on what would be most beneficial for their trade routes. They would sell weapons to one side and intelligence to the other, all while ensuring their own caravans passed through the war zones unharmed. They were masters of plausible deniability. If a caravan was raided, was it the work of random bandits or was it orchestrated by a Sogdian competitor to eliminate a rival? If a local ruler suddenly rebelled against his imperial overlord, was it a genuine uprising, or had a Sogdian advisor whispered promises of support and wealth in his ear? They were the invisible hand that guided the fortunes of the road. They knew where the armies were moving, which oases had fresh water, which officials were greedy, and which kings were weak. They turned this knowledge into gold. A chase in the desert was not always about escaping bandits. Sometimes it was one merchant's courier racing to deliver a piece of market-sensitive information before his rivals. Consider their position. They were the exclusive middlemen. The Chinese refused to travel much further west than the Pamir Mountains. The empires of Persia and later Rome were wary of venturing too far east. The Sogdians controlled the vital central corridor. They bought silk for a modest price in China and sold it for a fortune on the borders of the Persian Empire, who would then sell it to the Romans for an even more astronomical sum. Each step of the journey multiplied the price, and the Sogdians, along with their Persian counterparts, reaped the rewards. They funneled the wealth of great civilizations into their own coffers, building magnificent cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of art and learning that shone like jewels in the desert. But this position was precarious. They were a people without an army, their survival dependent on their wits and their ability to stay one step ahead of the great powers that surrounded them. Their lives were a constant balancing act. A single miscalculation, a poorly chosen allegiance, could bring the wrath of an empire down upon them. Trust was the most expensive and fleeting commodity on the Silk Road, and the Sogdians traded in it every single day. Their greatest secret was not a code or a map. It was the pretense that they were simple merchants when in fact they were the kings of a hidden empire, an empire built on whispers and carried on the wind. Their network, so efficient and so clandestine, eventually reached the edge of the Western world, the frontiers of the Parthian Empire. Here, the Sogdians and their trade goods encountered a new kind of player in the great game. The Parthians were not merchants, they were warriors and aristocrats, a martial empire that straddled the highlands of Persia and the plains of Mesopotamia. They saw the river of silk flowing from the east and understood its power immediately. They did not seek to produce it, nor did they wish to facilitate its trade out of some sense of global commerce. They sought to control its flow, to place a dam on this river of wealth and charge a toll that would make their empire the richest on earth. The Sogdians, masters of navigating shifting allegiances, now faced an immovable object, a military superpower that sat directly between the riches of the East and the insatiable hunger of the West. Their subtle games of influence and information were about to collide with the brutal realities of imperial ambition. The whispers and codes that worked in the oases of the Taklamakan would be tested against the cold steel of the Parthian cataphracts, the heavily armored cavalry that would soon become the nightmare of the Roman legions. The game was about to get much, much deadlier. The destination for all this silk, the ultimate consumer, was Rome. And Rome was sick with a fever, a silk fever. In the 1st century of the Common Era, this exotic fabric began to trickle into the city on the Tiber, and it drove the Roman elite into a frenzy of conspicuous consumption. Silk was more than just clothing, it was a statement. It was impossibly light, seductively transparent, and astronomically expensive. To wear silk was to show the world that you were powerful, wealthy, and utterly sophisticated. Moralists and senators were aghast. Pliny the Elder lamented that these transparent garments caused Roman matrons to appear naked in public. Seneca the Younger railed against the fabric that served not to protect the body, nor even to cover its modesty. But their outrage was futile. The demand was insatiable. Wealthy Romans would pay its weight in gold for the finest Chinese silk, a product whose origins were a complete mystery to them. They believed it grew on trees, a kind of magical fleece combed from exotic leaves. The Parthians, who controlled the trade, did absolutely nothing to correct this misunderstanding. Ignorance was profitable. This Roman hunger for silk created a catastrophic economic crisis. The empire was hemorrhaging gold and silver, sending vast quantities of its precious metals eastward to pay for this luxury. Historians estimate that at its peak, the Roman Empire was losing as much as 100 million sesterces every single year to the Eastern trade, a staggering sum that threatened to destabilize its entire economy. The gold flowed out of Rome into the coffers of Parthian and Sogdian merchants, and ultimately to China, which had little interest in Roman goods and demanded payment in hard currency. This created a profound imbalance of trade that deeply worried the Roman state. The real winner in this arrangement was the Parthian Empire. They had become the world's most powerful and infuriating middleman. They were the Great Wall between East and West, and they enforced their monopoly with ruthless efficiency. They strictly forbade Roman merchants from traveling east into their territory and prevented any Chinese or Sogdian traders from reaching the Roman frontier in Syria. All trade had to go through them at their prices. The Parthians were masters of geopolitical blackmail and disinformation. They skillfully played Rome and China against each other, ensuring the two superpowers never established direct contact. When a Chinese envoy named Gan Ying was dispatched in the year 97 of the Common Era, to travel to Rome, he made it as far as the Persian Gulf. There, Parthian officials regaled him with terrifying stories of the sea voyage, telling him it could take 2 years, that the winds were bewitched, and that a strange sickness would seize any man who attempted the journey, making him long for home until he died of sorrow. It was all a lie designed to scare him away. Terrified, Gan Ying turned back, and with him died China's best chance to establish a direct relationship with Rome for centuries. The Parthians understood that if the two giants at either end of the road ever shook hands, their own lucrative position as gatekeeper would vanish overnight. They supplemented this strategy of isolation with violence. Roman ambassadors sent to negotiate trade deals were often mysteriously assassinated. Caravans that tried to find alternate routes north of Parthian territory were attacked by bandits who were, in reality, Parthian irregular forces operating under a false flag. The Silk Road in their territory was less a trade route and more a protection racket on a continental scale. This simmering conflict finally erupted into open warfare. The Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, grew tired of Parthian arrogance. He dreamed of conquering the East, of seizing the source of its wealth and securing the Silk Road for Rome. In 53 before Christ, he led a massive army of 7 legions into Parthian-controlled Mesopotamia. The ensuing Battle of Carrhae was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. It was not just a military failure, it was a profound failure of intelligence. Crassus and his commanders completely underestimated the Parthians. They knew nothing of their enemy's tactics, particularly the devastating combination of swift horse archers and heavily armored cataphracts. They were lured deep into the desert, far from their supply lines, harassed and exhausted by endless volleys of arrows, and then shattered by the charge of the cataphracts. Crassus was captured and, according to legend, executed by having molten gold poured down his throat, a grim, symbolic punishment for his greed. The Parthians had proven their point. They were not just toll collectors, they were the masters of this domain. For the next 3 centuries, the frontier between Rome and Parthia would be a bloody stalemate, a battleground where control of the world's most valuable trade route was paid for in the lives of soldiers and the shattered ambitions of emperors. The Parthian wall held, and behind it, the golden river of silk continued to flow, its price ever increasing with every drop of blood spilled in the desert sands. The Parthian Empire, that great and formidable wall, eventually crumbled, worn down by centuries of war with Rome and internal decay. But the fall of one empire did not bring peace to the road. It only created a new and even more complex battlefield. The struggle for control shifted from the physical to the metaphysical. The new weapons were not swords and arrows, but ideas. Faith became the new currency of power, and missionaries became the new spies. Along the same dusty trails that carried silk and gold now traveled prophets and martyrs, their minds filled with visions of paradise and their saddlebags sometimes concealing coded messages and maps. Buddhism, which had begun its slow migration from India centuries earlier, now flourished in the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin. The Kushan Empire, which succeeded the Yuezhi, became fervent patrons of the faith, and from their domain, monks traveled east into China and west towards Persia. These were not just holy men seeking converts. They were often highly educated scholars, diplomats, and political advisors. A Buddhist monk, with his vows of poverty and his serene demeanor, could travel freely where a soldier or a merchant could not. He would be welcomed into the courts of kings and the tents of nomads, and he would listen. His spiritual authority gave him access to the highest levels of power, making him the perfect agent of influence. A wise monk advising a Turkic Khan on matters of state could subtly steer the policy of an entire nation to favor his own patrons. The monasteries that sprang up in the oasis cities like Kucha and Turpan became more than just centers of religious learning. They were intelligence hubs and safe houses. They were repositories of knowledge with vast libraries containing text not just on religion, but also on geography, medicine, and the politics of neighboring states. A traveling monk could deposit a piece of information in one monastery and another monk, traveling in the opposite direction, could retrieve it weeks later. They were nodes in a vast network of information that operated under the protection of religious sanctity. This was not always a subtle game. When a new faith arrived, it often clashed violently with the established order. The Silk Road became an arena for ideological warfare. The spread of Nestorian Christianity, a sect deemed heretical in the Byzantine Empire, followed the trade routes east. Nestorian communities appeared across Persia, Central Asia, and even into China and India. They were often merchants themselves, and their shared faith created a bond of trust that facilitated long-distance trade. But to the Zoroastrian priests of the Sasanian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians, these Christians were a fifth column, a dangerous foreign influence loyal to their enemies in Constantinople. Persecutions were frequent and brutal, with mass executions justified as a defense of the true faith, but often motivated by a desire to eliminate a rival commercial and intelligence network. Perhaps the most formidable of these religions of the road was Manichaeism. Born in Persia in the 3rd century, it was a syncretic faith that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Its founder, the prophet Mani, envisioned a universal church that would transcend all borders. His followers, the elect, were disciplined, organized, and utterly devoted. They established communities all along the Silk Road, from North Africa to the South China Sea. To outsiders, they were ascetics and scholars, but to the rulers of the empires they inhabited, they were a secret society, a transnational conspiracy whose ultimate allegiance was not to any earthly king, but to their own hidden leadership. The Manichaeans were accused of fomenting rebellion, of acting as spies for rival powers, and of seeking to undermine the very fabric of society. The Sasanian, Roman, and Chinese empires all, at various times, launched savage persecutions against them. These purges were campaigns of extermination designed to rip out the Manichaean network root and branch, but their faith and their organization proved incredibly resilient. They were masters of cryptography and clandestine communication, their sacred texts often written in complex codes to protect them from prying eyes. For centuries, they operated in the shadows, a testament to the power of an idea to become a weapon, a ghost that haunted the dreams of emperors. The battle for minds was proving to be just as bloody as the battle for markets. What would you trust more in a time of crisis? The strength of a sword to defend your body, or the power of a word to capture your soul? Let us know in the comments. The endless cycle of rising and falling empires, of religious wars and shifting alliances, had turned much of the Silk Road into a patchwork of warring states and dangerous territories. The chaos was bad for business, it was bad for everyone. This fragmentation and violence created a power vacuum, an opening for a force so brutal, so disciplined, and so ambitious that it would unify the known world in a storm of conquest. From the cold, windswept steppes of Mongolia, a new power was rising, one that would not just control a section of the road, but would consume it entirely. In the early 13th century, a man named Temujin, later known to the world as Genghis Khan, united the Mongol tribes and unleashed them upon the world. The Mongol whirlwind swept across Asia with unprecedented speed and ferocity. They were not interested in religious debates or trade negotiations. Their diplomacy was simple: submit and live, resist and die. One by one, the old kingdoms of the Silk Road fell before them: the Tangut, the Karakitan, the mighty Khwarezmian Empire. Within a few decades, the Mongols had forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. And with this conquest came something the Silk Road had never known: a single, unified authority. The era of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, had begun. For the first time, a merchant could travel from China to the Black Sea with a single passport, protected by the authority of the Great Khan. The roads were cleared of bandits, who were hunted down and exterminated with merciless efficiency. Trade flourished on a scale never before seen. But this peace, this order, came at a terrible price. It was a peace bought with the blood of millions and maintained by a system of total control and fear. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were master organizers and brilliant innovators in the art of imperial administration. Their greatest tool for controlling their vast domain was the yam, a revolutionary postal system of relay stations. These stations were placed roughly every 20 to 30 miles along the main roads, stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging for official couriers. A rider with a decree from the Khan could travel at incredible speeds, covering hundreds of miles a day, ensuring that the Khan's will was enforced across the continent with terrifying swiftness. But the yam was more than just a postal service. It was the central nervous system of a continent-spanning intelligence network. The yam was used to move not only messengers, but also spies, military intelligence, and punitive detachments. The station masters were required to report on all the movements in their area, on the mood of the local populace, on any hint of dissent. Furthermore, the Mongols turned every single user of the road into an unwilling informant. Merchants who were granted the privilege of safe passage were expected, under penalty of death, to report anything and everything they saw or heard on their travels. A careless word in a caravanserai in Samarkand could reach the ears of the Khan in his capital of Karakoram within weeks, and the consequences would be swift and final. This created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia. No one knew who might be an ear of the Khan. Anyone, from a humble camel driver to a wealthy merchant, could be an agent. This system of universal surveillance made organized resistance virtually impossible. In this world of iron order, the Venetian merchant Marco Polo arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis. He spent nearly 2 decades in the Khan's service, and his famous account of his travels would introduce Europe to the wonders of the East. But was he merely a merchant? Or was this clever Italian, with his keen eye for detail and his access to the highest levels of the Mongol court, also serving as an intelligence agent for the great Khan, reporting on the state of the empire's vast territories? The line between merchant and spy had never been blurrier. The Mongol intelligence network faced its greatest challenge from a shadowy organization that had perfected the art of espionage and political assassination over centuries, the Nizari Ismailis, better known to history as the Assassins. From their impregnable mountain fortress of Alamut in northern Persia, the Assassins had run a secret state, using a network of highly trained agents, the Fedayeen, to eliminate their political and religious enemies. They were masters of disguise, infiltration, and psychological warfare. For generations, they had been the great unseen power in the Islamic world. The confrontation between the Mongols and the Assassins was a clash between the two most effective and ruthless secret services of the medieval age. One operated a global system of overt control and surveillance, the other a clandestine network of covert operations and terror. The outcome was never really in doubt. In the year 1256, a Mongol army under the command of Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis's grandsons, laid siege to Alamut. The fortress that was thought to be unconquerable fell, and the Mongols systematically hunted down and destroyed every assassin stronghold in Persia. They captured the Assassin's legendary library, a repository of scientific knowledge and secret intelligence, and put it to the torch. They were not just defeating an enemy, they were erasing them from history. The Mongol peace was absolute, and it tolerated no rivals. The entire length of the road, from its beginning to its end, now answered to a single master. The Mongols had secured the artery of the world. They controlled the land, the oases, the mountain passes. But the greatest profits from the Silk Road were not made in the deserts of Central Asia. They were made at its final destination, in the bustling ports of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where the silks and spices of the East were sold to the nobles and burghers of Europe. And here a new war was being fought, a war of fleets and finance, of daggers and diplomacy. The protagonists were 2 Italian maritime republics, the most serene Republic of Venice and the Republic of Genoa. For centuries, these 2 cities, one built on a lagoon, the other clinging to a rocky coastline, were locked in a deadly rivalry for control of the eastern trade. They were the final link in the chain, the gatekeepers to the markets of Europe, and they fought over this privilege with a ferocity that matched any empire. Their war was not fought for territory or faith, it was fought for market share. They were the godfathers of a new global capitalism, and they played the game with no rules. Venice, with its powerful navy and its strategic location at the head of the Adriatic, had long dominated the trade with the Byzantine Empire and the Levant. The Venetian doges, the elected rulers of the Republic, were not kings. They were chief executive officers of a vast commercial enterprise. Their ambassadors were salesmen, and their admirals were enforcers. Genoa, their ambitious rival, constantly sought to break the Venetian monopoly, establishing their own trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean. The struggle between them played out in 1,000 different ways. There were epic sea battles where hundreds of galleys clashed in brutal, bloody combat. But the real war was fought in the shadows. Both republics maintained extensive spy networks in Constantinople, Alexandria, and the other great trading cities of the East. Their agents, disguised as merchants or priests, sought to bribe officials, steal trade secrets, and sabotage the operations of their rivals. Industrial espionage was rampant. Venetian agents were legendary for their skill in stealing the secrets of competitors, from the methods of Syrian glassmaking to the designs of Genoese ships. In return, the Genoese were masters of economic warfare, capable of orchestrating financial panics and disrupting Venetian supply chains through clever manipulation of markets. This was a world where a contract was often sealed with a dagger. Hired killers and poisoners were a standard tool of statecraft. A successful merchant who was becoming too much of a problem for the competition might suddenly fall ill with a mysterious fever or be found with a knife in his back in a dark alley in the port district of Acre. The Venetian Council of Ten, the city's secretive state security service, was a model of ruthless efficiency, a combination of intelligence agency and corporate enforcement division. They monitored every aspect of Venetian life, rooting out spies and traitors with cold precision. Nothing better illustrates the cynical brilliance of Venetian strategy than the Fourth Crusade in the year 1204. The original goal of the crusade was to recapture Jerusalem, but the Venetian doge, the cunning 90-year-old Enrico Dandolo, saw a golden opportunity. The crusading army was indebted to Venice for providing transport ships. Dandolo cleverly diverted the entire crusade not to the Holy Land, but to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and Venice's main commercial competitor. Under the guise of a holy war, the Crusaders sacked the city, the greatest Christian metropolis in the world. The Venetians made sure they got the best of the loot and, more importantly, secured exclusive trading rights and control of key ports throughout the Byzantine Empire. It was a masterstroke of corporate raiding disguised as a pious quest. A dagger in the back is often more effective than a sword to the front, especially when you can make someone else hold it. The Genoese were no less ruthless. They allied themselves with the enemies of Venice whenever it suited them, backing the resurgent Byzantines and carving out their own commercial empire on the Black Sea, with their great colony at Kaffa in the Crimea becoming a vital terminus of the Northern Silk Road. The competition was a zero-sum game. One republic's gain was the other's loss. They fought for every port, every contract, every ounce of pepper, and every yard of silk. The splendor of the Renaissance, the magnificent palaces of Venice and Genoa, the art of Titian and the explorations of Columbus were all built on the profits of this trade. But that wealth was stained with the blood of a secret, century-long war, a war fought not just in the sun-drenched Mediterranean, but in the shadow of the East, for the prize at the end of the long road from China. Their glittering world of global commerce, so interconnected and so profitable, was also incredibly fragile. The very roots that brought them unimaginable wealth were about to deliver an apocalypse, a horror that no fleet could stop and no amount of gold could bribe. The year is 1347. The Mongol peace has created a world more connected than ever before. Goods, ideas, and people move across the Eurasian landmass with unprecedented ease. But something else is moving with them, a silent, an invisible passenger hiding in the blood of rats and the bellies of fleas. The Black Death. Its journey began somewhere on the steppes of Central Asia, and it travelled west along the caravan routes, a spectre of death that moved at the speed of a walking man. The Silk Road, the artery of life for the ancient world, had become a conduit for its extinction. The plague reached the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a city then under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde. And here, history records what may be the first act of sophisticated biological warfare. The Mongol army, ravaged by the plague themselves, began catapulting the infected corpses of their dead soldiers over the city walls. The Genoese, horrified, tried to dispose of the bodies, but it was too late. The disease was inside. When Genoese ships fled Kaffa, they took the plague with them, delivering it to Constantinople, to Sicily, and then to the heart of Europe. The result was a cataclysm unlike any other in human history. The Black Death wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. It shattered economies, toppled social orders, and instilled a deep psychological trauma that would linger for generations. The Silk Road was devastated. Trade ground to a halt. The great caravan cities became ghost towns, their populations decimated, their markets empty. The delicate web of trust and communication that had been built over centuries simply dissolved. The Mongol Empire itself, already fracturing, was fatally weakened by the pandemic, breaking apart into warring successor states. The Pax Mongolica was over. The world descended into chaos, and on the ruins of this shattered world a new conqueror arose, a man who saw the collapse not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. His name was Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane. A Turkic Mongol warlord from a minor tribe near Samarkand, he was a military genius of terrifying ambition and unparalleled cruelty. He sought to rebuild the Mongol Empire not as a ruler, but as its destroyer and heir. Tamerlane's campaigns, which raged across Asia for over 3 decades, were not simply conquests. They were a deliberate and systematic effort to seize total control of the Silk Road by annihilating all competition. He did not just defeat his enemies, he erased them. When he captured a city, he would often massacre its entire population, sparing only the most skilled artisans, who were sent back to his capital in Samarkand to beautify it. His infamous pyramids of skulls built from the heads of his slain enemies were not acts of random savagery. They were a calculated instrument of terror, a message to any other city that dared to defy him. He systematically destroyed the great trading centers that could rival his own. He sacked Delhi in India, Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, Baghdad in Mesopotamia. He crippled the Golden Horde and shattered the rising Ottoman Empire. He was rerouting the entire flow of global trade by force, making Samarkand its one and only center. He was attempting to become the sole owner, the absolute monopolist of the Silk Road. The Iron Lame, as he was called due to an old battle injury, was trying to bring the world to its knees and rule it by making it bleed. He was the embodiment of the road's darkest truth, that the ultimate prize was not wealth, but absolute control, and that some men would burn the world to achieve it. In the face of total chaos, would you follow a savior who promises order through peace, or a tyrant who guarantees it through fear? Write your answer in the comments below. Tamerlane's brutal empire of fear did not long survive his death in 1405. His sons and grandsons squabbled over his inheritance, and his meticulously constructed monopoly over the trade routes collapsed back into chaos. The world, traumatized by a century of plague and war, was weary of the old ways. The land routes across Asia were more dangerous and unpredictable than ever. The remnants of the Mongol hordes, the Ottoman Turks, and the new Safavid dynasty in Persia all fought for control of the western sections of the road, imposing crippling taxes and making safe passage a gambler's bet. For the kingdoms of Europe, particularly Portugal and Spain, the situation was intolerable. They were at the very end of the supply chain, forced to pay exorbitant prices for spices and silks to the Venetian and Genoese merchants, who in turn paid the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who dealt with the traders of the East. The desire to break this chain of monopolies became the driving obsession of the age. They dreamed of a new way, a way to bypass the treacherous lands of Asia and the hostile empires that controlled them. They dreamed of the sea. The great voyages of discovery were not born from a pure spirit of adventure. They were a massive, state-sponsored special operation designed to outflank the old Silk Road. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, he was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for a back door to the riches of Asia, a sea route that would allow Spain to cut out every single middleman and trade directly with the source. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498, he achieved that dream for Portugal. It was a death sentence for the overland caravans. Why risk months or years crossing hostile deserts and mountains, paying endless tolls and bribes when a ship could carry more cargo, more cheaply and more safely, directly from the source? The great economic and political axis of the world began to shift from the continental heart of Asia to the maritime coasts of the Atlantic. The ocean, once a barrier, was now the highway. The Great Silk Road began to die. It did not happen overnight, but was a long, slow, agonizing decline. The decline was marked by a final series of bloody wars fought over its remnants. The three great Islamic empires of the early modern period, the Ottomans in Turkey, the Safavids in Persia, and the Mughals in India, were all, in a sense, heirs to the traditions of the Silk Road. They fought ferociously over the dwindling trade flows. The rivalry between the Sunni Ottomans and the Shia Safavids was particularly bitter, a conflict fueled by both religious hatred and economic competition. Their wars repeatedly closed the land routes, making the sea routes even more attractive to Europeans. The magnificent caravanserais, the great fortified inns that had served as hotels and trading posts for 1,000 years, began to fall into disrepair. The oasis cities, once vibrant centers of global exchange, withered. The trails grew quiet. Merchants became bandits preying on the few desperate travelers who still dared to use the old ways. The knowledge of the routes passed down through generations of cameleers and guides began to fade. The romance of the sea, discoveries concealed a brutal reality. For every new port that flourished, an ancient city in the desert died. It was the end of an era, a quiet, dusty end on the forgotten trails where civilizations had once met, traded, and fought for control of the world. The desert was reclaiming its own. For centuries, the Silk Road lay dormant, a ghost of its former self. Its great cities were ruins, its history buried under sand. But the strategic importance of its geography never vanished. In the 19th century, the desolate landscapes of Central Asia once again became the stage for a global power struggle, a new kind of conflict fought with new rules and new players. This was the Great Game, a prolonged and intense rivalry between the British and Russian empires for supremacy in the region. To the British, who controlled India, Central Asia was a crucial buffer zone protecting the jewel in the crown of their empire from the relentless southward expansion of Russia. To the Russians, expanding into Central Asia was a matter of imperial destiny and a way to pressure the British. The ancient routes of the Silk Road became the front lines of this undeclared war, a cold war of espionage, intrigue, and political maneuvering. It was a duel between the British lion and the Russian bear, played out in the shadows of the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush. The players in this game were not merchants but intelligence officers, often disguised as explorers, scientists, or even pilgrims. They were a new breed of spy, educated, resilient, and utterly dedicated to their cause. Men like the Russian Nikolai Przewalski, officially a geographer and naturalist, undertook massive expeditions that were, in reality, sophisticated military reconnaissance missions, mapping terrain, assessing resources, and gauging the political loyalties of local rulers. His British counterparts, like Francis Younghusband, were soldier diplomats who led armed missions deep into Tibet and Central Asia, ostensibly to open trade, but in reality to counter Russian influence and secure British interests. The ancient cities of Samarkand, Bukhara and Khiva, now the capitals of decadent and weak Khanates, were once again transformed into nests of spies. Every European traveller was suspected of being an agent. Local khans and emirs were bribed, manipulated, and occasionally overthrown in coups orchestrated by Russian or British handlers. It was a war of maps and rumours. Agents painstakingly created detailed charts of mountain passes and river valleys, information that could be vital in a future invasion. They spread disinformation, planting stories of troop movements or impending attacks to panic their rivals and force them into making a mistake. This was a profoundly personal and dangerous game. Officers would vanish into the wilderness for years at a time, out of contact with their superiors, relying on their wits and their courage to survive. They faced disease, treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of capture and execution by suspicious local rulers or rival agents. Chases through mountain passes, tense standoffs in dusty bazaars, and midnight betrayals were the reality of their lives. A single agent with a bag of gold and a persuasive tongue could change the allegiance of an entire tribe, shifting the delicate balance of power in the region. Both empires used the latest technology like the telegraph to transmit intelligence back to their capitals in London and St. Petersburg, but they also used the most ancient methods, relying on networks of local informants, secret societies, and the timeless power of gossip and rumour to achieve their objectives. The Great Game was a classic spy thriller played out on a continental scale, a testament to the enduring strategic value of the land that had once been the crossroads of the world. The empires had changed, but the fundamental struggle for control of the heart of Asia remained as deadly as ever. The Great Game, with its romantic heroes and clandestine duels, was the final, flickering echo of the Silk Road's ancient life. But the 20th century was dawning, and it would be an age of iron and steam, not silk and camels. The end came, not with a bang, but with the clatter of steel wheels on steel rails. The Russian Empire began constructing the Trans-Caspian Railway in the 1880s, pushing a line of iron from the shores of the Caspian Sea deep into Central Asia, through Bukhara and Samarkand. Further east, the Trans-Siberian and Chinese Eastern Railways were cutting across Manchuria. This was not progress arriving in the desert. It was the final nail in the coffin of the caravan trade. The railroad could move troops and goods faster, cheaper, and more reliably than any 1,000-camel caravan. It was the ultimate tool of imperial control. The iron horse had killed the camel, and with it, the last vestiges of the old road. But the death of the road's commerce did not mean the end of its secrets. In fact, it made them more valuable and more dangerous than ever. For millennia, the operational knowledge of the Silk Road, the secret routes, the safe houses, the coded languages, the networks of trusted contacts, the political and commercial intelligence had been guarded by a collection of secret societies, merchant guilds, and hereditary clans. These groups, like the Sogdians before them, were the true masters of the road. Their loyalty was to the network itself, not to any empire. They had survived the rise and fall of dynasties, the shifting of religions, and the endless wars, but they could not survive the modern state. As the European empires, and later the emerging powers of Japan and a fractured China, prepared for the titanic industrial slaughter of the First World War, their new intelligence agencies began a hunt. They were not looking for silk or spices. They were looking for the archives of the Silk Road. They understood that whoever could control these ancient networks of influence and information would have a decisive advantage in the coming global conflict. The last keepers of the secrets found themselves caught between the grinding gears of modernity. And so in the final years before the Great War, a silent, desperate struggle took place in the forgotten corners of Asia. Agents from Russia, Britain, Germany, and Japan hunted for the leaders of these ancient guilds. They offered bribes. They made threats. They sought to acquire the maps, the codebooks, and the lists of contacts that were the accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years. The keepers of this knowledge faced a terrible choice. They could sell their secrets to one of the new powers, ensuring their own survival, but betraying a sacred trust. Or they could resist and be destroyed. They chose a third option. In a final, defiant act of self-immolation, they began to erase themselves from history. They burned their libraries, they destroyed their maps, they led their pursuers on false trails into the desert. The last masters of the Silk Road, the men and women who held the keys to a continent, systematically dismantled their own creation. They chose oblivion. They believed that their knowledge in the hands of the modern world, with its machine guns and its total wars, was too dangerous to exist. They preferred to let the secrets die, to bury the living system of the road, to save it from the desecration of being used as a weapon in the brutal conflicts of the new century. The story of the Great Silk Road, therefore, does not end with a final caravan reaching its destination. It ends in silence. It ends with the smoke of burning manuscripts rising into the desert sky. The greatest secret of the Silk Road was not how to make silk, but how the world was truly connected, and its final guardians decided that humanity was no longer worthy of knowing it. They chose oblivion for the sake of peace. But today, in the era of global information networks and digital espionage, their act makes one think. What would you choose for our world? A safe ignorance that hides dangerous levers of power, or a universal awareness that could provoke new conflicts? Write your answer in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us.